It is a great pleasure to be invited to Japan Society and given the opportunity to make my remarks in this occasion to the very distinguished guests of this room. I would like to raise two small issues on the first presentation. One is that if I were American, I think I'm a typical Republican. But fortunately, I'm not a supporter for Mr. Trump. And I would like to raise one reservation on his remarks. That is unilateralism or unilateral nature of U.S. Japan Security Alliance. As you know, Article 5 of U.S. Japan Security Treaty prescribe each party recognize that an armed attack against either party in the territory under the administration of Japan would be a danger to its own peace and safety, and declare that it would act meets the common danger in accordance with the constitutional provision and procedure. That means that if Japan will be attacked from a third country, U.S. has a legal obligation to protect us. On the other hand, even U.S. will be attacked by a third party, Japan has no legal obligation to protect and meet to join this armed attack with the United States. I think this is the legal nature of U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Yes, as Mr. Trump indicates, the nature of this security is right. But however, if you look at Article 6, for the purpose of contributing to the security of Japan and the maintenance in international peace and security in use by its air, land, and naval forces of facilities and area in Japan. I'm working for the National Security Division of North American Bureau a long time, but I would like to raise one issue. That is U.S. forces, now it's almost 450,000 personnel. They use 130 area and facilities. Almost 73% is concentrated in Okinawa. But U.S. forces utilize access to the area and facility to engage the Vietnam War, and Gulf War, Afghan War, Iraq War, and some other contingency in the Asian Pacific. I think U.S. presence and U.S. access to the facility and the area in Japan is the most important cornerstone of U.S. policy in Asia. And that is the first point. So Article 5 prescribe, yes, U.S. has obligation to protect us, but Article 6 define that the U.S. forces can use the area and the facility in Japan. I think not necessarily a compensation, but it is very important to offset measure on the nature of U.S.-Japan alliance. The second is that in order to make U.S.-Japan alliance more safe, more stable, I'm working for many effort to pay political costs and economic burden, and especially if you look at Okinawa, I think we have a very serious contribution to make a U.S. base stable and effort. When I was a defense minister, I was suffered from a very serious resistance of Okinawa people. But I visited again and again and again to meet the governor and the mayor, 21 mayors, almost all mayors, to persuade and explain why U.S. deployment of Osprey in Okinawa is important not only for Japan but also in Okinawa. And the second is that looking at our equipment, when I was assigned self-defense forces, we use almost all U.S. made weapon system, including F-4, F-104, F-15, F-35, it's C or it's D, AWACS and Aegis and Patriot and AV-7 and air-fuel tanker and Global Hawk and Tomahawk and many kind of helicopter, the P-3C, all American-made. Why we purchase such kind of American-made? I think this is one of the major to offset, compensate some sort of unilateral nature of U.S. Japan security arrangement. We suffered from our budget for defense equipment agency because our FMS purchase American equipment from United States exclusively, more than 70% of our total budget. Also, we spend host nation support. Next year, 190 billion yen, almost 1.6 billion US dollars. I think this is almost 36,000 US dollar for one military personnel. I think this is the most significant contribution among US allies. But that is the first point. I think we have to take a look at the more comprehensive picture to understand the nature of U.S.-Japan alliance. The second is that in order to offset this unilateralism or unequal nature of U.S.-Japan alliance, Prime Minister Abe took a very strong initiative to pass through the peace and the security legislation, which was approved last September in a diet. Maybe you remember that Article 9 of the Constitution prescribes aspiring sincerely to international peace based on the justice and order. Japanese people forever renounce was sovereignty right of nation and threat of use of force as means of settling international dispute. That is the one part of, first part of Article 9, but second part, in order to accomplish the aim of preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air force, as well as war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. As you know, this article never mentioned that self-defense right. However, we interpreted this constitution is that this constitution allow for Japan to exercise our domestic self-defense right, but collective self-defense right is not permitted under the interpretation of Constitution. But however, security environment has changed, and our government has reached the conclusion that not only when the armed attack against occurs, but also when armed attack against a foreign country, that is in close relationship with Japan occurs, and as a result, threaten Japan's survival and pose a clear danger to fundamentally overturn people's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness when there is no other appropriate measure available to repeal the attack and ensure the Japan's survival and protest the people. A use of force to minimum extent necessarily should be interpreted to be permitted under the Constitution as measures for self-defense. This decision was made to exercise collective self-defense right of minimum extent necessary to use of force under the interpretation of Constitution in the Cabinet meeting July 2014. This is the Prime Minister's initiative to compensate the unilateral nature of security treaty to more equal states as possible. My point is that our government have a very drastic decision making to offset the nature of U.S. Japan alliance. But however, almost more than half of the public against this legislation last September. We explain and persuade and we host some kind of discussion and symposium to explain why we have to exercise a limited collective self-defense right under such circumstances. But still almost 40% of the people against this legislation, which is absolutely violation of interpretation of Constitution. But this legislation is a maximum effort under current Constitution. If we would like to do more, we have to reform Constitution in a possible future. That is the point which I would like to make my first stage.
Thank you very much, Morimoto Sensei. In a very short amount of time, you were able to cover two areas that I'd like us to come back to, and I'm sure the audience is interested in. One is the number of changes in policy of the Japanese government in the last year through the new security legislation and also with the new U.S. Japan guidelines and defense cooperation. And the second is the politics that surround this, both within Japan, the politics around constitutional revision, and also politics within the U.S. Japan alliance. So maybe we'll go in that direction to Dr. Green. To Mike, if I could ask you, since Morimoto Sensei brought up the new security legislation, as we know, but perhaps you might want to explain some more to the audience, Prime Minister Abe made a number of compromises to his original goal of this legislation. First, in the announcement of his intention to reinterpret the Constitution in July of 2014, and then finally with the new security legislation that was passed in September of last year. And it seems to me, from the U.S. side, the U.S. also didn't get all that it wanted from its initial discussions with Mr. Abe. So my question to you is it enough in the end? Should we be happy now with the new security legislations that's come through and work under that framework? Or should Mr. Abe and the U.S. perhaps, or separately the U.S., push for a little bit more of what Mr. Abe originally wanted?
Well, the first thing I should confess is I'm an expert on security policy in the U.S. Japan alliance, so if I answer your question by saying it's enough, I'd have to retire, although my wife might be in favor of that. So let me think about that. And first say how important Morimoto Sensei's initial framing was. I decades ago, was a student at Tokyo University and working for a member of the Diet named Shina Moto, who was one of the leaders of the defense and alliance issues in the Diet. And my job was literally what is called in Japanese a kabanmochi. I literally carried bags of papers. And I would go over to the Gaimusho, to the foreign ministry, and I would give some of these papers to Morimoto-san's staff. And every once in a while he would come over and say, arigato. And I would walk back to the Diet. I was so proud of myself because he was, even then, one of the most prominent experts on security policy and defense, both operations policy and law. And I don't think any historian of the alliance would disagree with me when I say he's been the most expert defense minister Japan's ever had. So let me try to answer your question and compliment in both spellings of the word compliment, give a U.S. perspective, or at least one U.S. perspective. When the defense guidelines were first put up for review, as proposed by then Defense Minister Morimoto, and it was obvious that collective self-defense would come up and have to be revised to make progress, I think the prevailing view in the Pentagon among those who follow this was that it would have been better to have what's called a negative list. So just tell us what we can't do so that we can plan together and have flexibility, because defense planners know that in any crisis, the enemy, the weather, logistics will not do what you think. And as Eisenhower said, you have to have a plan, but on day one of any contact with the enemy or crisis, the plan is no good because you can't anticipate everything. And so I was in the Pentagon when the defense guidelines were reviewed in the late 90s. And what people wanted was some clarity to be able to plan for crises in the area around Japan. Then in 2014, the Pentagon wanted the negative list, so they would be told what we can't do. So I actually met with Prime Minister Abe in 2013 and asked him about this, and he said, no, I'm going to do a positive list. I'm going to say what we can do. And his logic was he needed Komeito, and he wanted the Japanese public to clearly understand what this would mean for the defense forces. So it wasn't ideal from a U.S. perspective, but we're democracies, and that was, from one of the best supporters of the alliance we have, the path he chose. It got pared back again. Of course, Kitaoka Sensei put out a special advisory panel, and it was pared back from that. But at the end of the day, the interpretation of what's allowed in the area of collective self-defense, the defense guidelines and the legislation all do something that's very important, in my view. And that is all of the obstacles that blocked us in 1998. We revised the defense guidelines. Briefly, by way of history, the first ever defense guidelines for bilateral cooperation were in the late 70s, and only said how we would cooperate if Japan was directly attacked. And since the Soviet Union was expanding in those days, defending Japan basically contained the Soviet Union, so it was enough. It never touched on Article 6, what we would do in the event of a crisis around Japan. In 1998, of course, the defense guidelines were revised to cover that area. But, and frankly, the Pentagon was quite excited. But we almost immediately hit, boom, collective self-defense. And in particular, this gets quite komakai and technical, but whether or not Japan had the right to be integrated in the use of force, Buru Kokoshi no Itaika. And the officials on the Japanese side said, we can't actually plan the way you would plan because we don't know whether or not what we're talking about is collective self-defense and integration in the use of force. So, fast forward, when this legislation finally passed, that core right to be integrated in the use of force is survived. Now, there are lots of caveats. It's only rear area, it's not attack combat, but the US side never wanted that anyway. Just wanted logistics support, anti-submarine warfare, that protecting the areas, and the US historically is the spear and Japan is the shield, but we wanted a stronger shield. So it did that. So that I think is quite important. And in the history of the alliance, every change has been incremental since the treaties in 1951 and 1960. Every change has been incremental. But this is probably the biggest increment in a long time. I would say since the 1960 Security Treaty revision. And the reason is most of the post-war history of Japanese defense policy, for most officials and politicians in Tokyo, was making sure that Japan never got entrapped, makikomaru, entrapped in an American war in Asia. And, I don't want to agree with Donald Trump, but in a way, he's partly right, because they were really good at it. And all of these Cabinet Legal Bureau interpretations of what's allowed and not allowed, in my view, were largely designed to put walls up using the Article 9 to make sure that the U.S. would protect Japan, but Japan never got stuck with responsibilities in the event of a crisis in Asia. That started changing in the 90s. What this law does, in my view, is it takes away the core of that and ensures that the U.S., of course the Japanese Prime Minister has to decide, but it allows planners in the U.S. and Japan to start thinking about, if we had to act together, what would we do? So it opens up the way, really for the first time in our history, to plan what we would do in a crisis around Asia, which is really important and ultimately is necessary because Japan now is in the front lines. The Senkakus, North Korean, when the Cabinet Legal Bureau was saying, we can't do all these things, North Korea didn't have 300 nodongs aimed at Japan. There weren't Chinese frigates and destroyers painted white and called Coast Guard vessels constantly every day entering the Senkaku area. So Japan's in the front line, and it's very logical to me that we would have more ability to plan together for crises in the region.
Thank you, Mike, for putting it in a context of the regional context and also pulling in the past and the present from our title and thinking about the U.S. Japan alliance. Morimoto Sensei, let me come back to you and ask you, especially if you could help explain a little bit more about the contemporary politics of this issue. It seems to me you're in a perfect position to help explain this to us as someone who's currently a special advisor to the Minister of Defense, who is a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, and previously you served as the Minister of Defense under the Democratic Party of Japan, now the opposition. So I wonder if you could explain a bit, what is it that Japanese people disagree about this legislation? There's been a lot of compromise. It wasn't what Prime Minister Abe initially wanted. There's a lot of qualifications about when the use of force can be used. But as you mentioned, still the support rate for this new legislation, it depends on who's conducting the polling, but it's rarely more than 50%. It sort of hovers around that area. So maybe with an election coming up in Japan in July in the upper house, could you explain a little bit about where people disagree, and if I'll pose the same question I posed to Dr. Green, is it enough? Should the Abe government just stick with this now, or should it push for more?
Hard to say the political background of this legislation. However, I shared some point with Mike Green on this issue. As you know, when Mr. Abe was first Prime Minister for the first stage in 2006-2007,
yes,
he intended to pass through the collective self-defense right in a political stage. To establish advisory group, to encourage advisory group to recommend the collective self-defense right will be appropriate and to allow under the interpretation of Constitution by a final recommendation. But at the final stage, he resigned as Prime Minister, unfortunately. Then, the second terms of administration, he established again the advisory group headed by Kitaoka Sensei, Todai professor.
So this now is in December of 2012 when he becomes Prime Minister the second time.
That's right. And still, Prime Minister intend for advisory group to recommend use of collective self-defense right in an international standard. And also he received this recommendation as a policy guideline to change the interpretation of Constitution. Without any constitutional reform. But however, Communist Party and the legal office of cabinet, Prime Minister's office cabinet, strongly against, because they stick to the explanation of the Diet on the interpretation of Constitution. So I think Prime Minister, as a first stage, he is a political leader of principle and discipline, but he changed a little bit to the more flexible and realistic approach, and to make a compromise between the rightist and also a Communist Party and also legal office of cabinet itself. And the conclusion was that, as I said, the limited exercise of limited collective self-defense right will be allowed under the interpretation of Constitution. That is a maximum range of his, I think, a political maneuver. So, but as I said, the people never understand. Okay, the government used to explain to the people, collective self-defense right is not allowed the interpretation of Constitution. Now, even limited. Why the limited collective self-defense right is allowed? So the government explained that in the case of, for example, in a case of missile attack to the U.S ships, which may be operations to defend Japan's territory. If Japan cannot do anything to help U.S ships, alliance may bankrupt. And also, this missile may attack Japan's territory at the next second. We cannot survive. So our activities to help U.S. ships is not only protect U.S. ships, but also Japan's territory or Japan's people life. That activity can be defined the collective self-defense right. However, we cannot interpret such activity is even not prohibited by Constitution. So this is a very Japanese type special interpretation of Constitution. I think, so for example, Mr. Tawara Soichiro is a very famous Japanese journalist, say, this is not collective self-defense. It is individual self-defense, right? But no, we cannot expand the interpretation of Constitution to out of territory. This is a very dangerous. We have a very serious historical experience to offer our self-defense right to invade another territory of another Asian country before the World War II. So we cannot allow such kind of individual self-defense right to beyond our territory. So very, very unique. It's very special interpretation. I always say that the Japanese type interpretation of international law. But as I said, this is a maximum limitation of interpretation. So under this legislation, as I said, Japan can exercise the limited collective self-defense right to help and assist U.S. activity if U.S. will be attacked by a third country. But in addition to Japan can make a logistic support to United States and other allied forces such as Australia in situations that will have an important influence, peace and security of Japan. That is the maximum of contribution under the new peace and security legislation.
Morimoto-sensei, you're reminding me of, I was in Japan in the days before the cabinet decision was released on July 1st of 2014, and Prime Minister Abe had a press conference with the visual aids of the mother carrying the child and the bomb blowing up nearby and how collective self-defense was so important, and another visual aid had the missile going up and showing these interceptions. So thank you for helping to elaborate these scenarios. Mike, as Morimoto-sensei showed us in his opening remarks, you can't come to New York City and not talk about the leading presidential candidates, both of whom claim New York City as their home. And I'd like to ask you briefly about that. On the Republican side, Mr. Trump, as Morimoto-sensei has mentioned, has expressed concerns about the U.S. Japan alliance. In particular, this idea that Japan isn't paying enough for what it gets, that we're not getting a good deal, and Mr. Trump's all about the deal. And on the Democratic side as well, Hillary Clinton has expressed concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the current administration and many Republicans also argue is a very important next strategic step. So I wonder if, as this election moves forward, the campaign season, and then after the actual election, do you expect that tensions are going to arise between the U.S. and Japan over these sorts of issues? Or if you don't think so, why not, given the sort of provocative statements that are being made in election season?
So as you know, Donald Trump has a detailed 15-point plan for modernizing the U.S.-Japan defense relationship. Obviously, he doesn't.
The secret memo.
Yeah. There are two current candidates right now who could sit up on the stage and participate in this discussion knowledgeably, and it's Marco Rubio and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was the most focused on the U.S.-Japan alliance in the Obama administration cabinet, by far. And active particularly on the Senkaku problem as Secretary of State. And Marco Rubio was chair of the Asia Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, traveled to Japan, knows a lot about the security relationship. Governor Kasich has been governing Ohio, so he might not be as up to date, but he's experienced, former member of the Defense Armed Services Committee. So that leaves Donald Trump. Like a lot of parents in Washington, I want my kids to grow up interested in elections, and we always have an election every year before we go vote. The dog almost always wins, but I get my kids to vote, and my wife and I will not let them watch Donald Trump on TV because he says things to and about people we tell our 8-year-old are not allowed. So it's disconcerting, to say the least. And I just came back from Seoul and Tokyo, and it's disconcerting for our allies. That said, I personally don't think that Donald Trump's comments on Japan, or Korea for that matter, reflect the views of the Republican Party, or the Republican Party rank and file, or the American public, or members of Congress, or state and local government, or academics for the most part. I think it is a unique view he seems to have developed in New York in the 80s. So I'm not a New Yorker, I'm from Washington. So you explain to me, Sakurai-san, what's in the water. I'm told the water is very delicious and safe, but somehow Donald Trump picked up these ideas about Japan that are, almost 30 years completely out of date. His criticism of the unfairness of the alliance, I think, is just basically part of a theme he uses everywhere, that we're getting cheated and ripped off and it's somebody else's fault. And Japan's in a long line of domestic and international, governments, peoples who he blames. And as I said, it doesn't reflect the American view of Japan. So just to give you a few examples, the Pew Foundation surveyed late last year about trade, and 70% of Americans support free trade, and over half support TPP in that. Now, in certain states like Michigan and Ohio, trade's more controversial, but across the country, support for free trade, which dipped during the Lehman Brothers shocks, is back up to where it was at its highest level. So he's not, except for a few states, he's not speaking for the majority of American people. Now, I worry a little bit he might affect the view of American people, but he's certainly not reflecting it. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in its surveys, showed late last year, in December, I think, that respect for Japan was at an all-time high with the American public. And Japan is listed as the fourth most trusted country in the world by Americans and the most trusted in Asia. Now, they don't ask about Australia in the survey. I think Australia would probably beat Japan because we have a long history. But Japan is way ahead of every other country in Asia, and only behind Britain, Canada, and almost sort of tied with Germany. And in the similar surveys, the Chicago Council and others have asked about the U.S. Japan alliance, and support for defending Japan or Korea if attacked is the highest it's ever been in these polls. So if you go to Congress, I've never seen more bipartisan support and active interest in the alliance. I've never seen more state and local government interest. You ask any consul general from the foreign ministry. So I think in the end, this is a very weird and painful political year, especially for a center-right internationalist, or whatever you are, center-left or centrist internationalist. It's pretty painful.
It's painful for most
and
of us.
It's embarrassing and it's painful. But it is not based on any constituency or movement, or I don't know who he would get to govern who would agree with this. So it's bad, but it's not that bad. And we'll have to see. In the betting markets, Mr. Trump has a 20 to 30% chance, which is a lot higher than a lot of us would have expected, but it's 20 to 30% chance. And we'll see what happens tonight. You know, Ohio and Florida primaries will be really key.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to go out to the audience. We've already discussed a number of areas of the past and the present, a little on the future. I had a number of other questions about Japan's historical past, about the regional security environment, but in the spirit of democracy, let's hear from the people. I'd like to take two questions to start us off, and I'd ask that you actually ask a question and join us at the reception after this event in order to share your comments with us. But if you can pose a succinct question, then hopefully I can get back to the audience for a couple of more questions after the first round. So please just tell us your name and your affiliation and your brief question. Who'd like to be first? Over here.
My name is Charles Henderson, and I'd like to know regarding the 50-50 split in terms of the people that are in favor of the most recent legislation, those that are not. Who are those people? What makes up the 50%?
Okay. And do we have a second question? Yes, right in the center.
My name is Humiko Bacon.
We're going to pass the microphone down. Excuse me. And if you could tell us your affiliation, I'd be grateful.
I'm retired, retired teacher. My question I can ask now? Is
Please.
it okay? All right. I understand right after World War II how Japanese constitution was drafted. And Allied or America, main target was to destroy Japanese military force. That's how Article 9 came out. Now, knowing all the international situation has changed, now I think there are two questions. One is how much we can expand interpretation of Article 9 so we can join collective self-defense. There's a lot of discussion about that. Or we should, do you think we need to reform part of a Japanese constitution, particularly Article 9? What is your opinion about it?
Great, thank you very much. So we have two related questions to support for constitutional revision and the changes that have been made and whether formal constitutional revision needs to take place.
Okay. I tried to do my best to answer the questions. One is that, as I said, when this peace and security legislation passed through in a diet last September, or more than half of the people against, mainly because this legislation is a violation of Constitution. And also, if we implement this legislation, our government may introduce a draft system. Draft system, draft system. And also, some social party and the communist parties say that this is a legislation for war. Means that Japan will engage a war with another country under this legislation. That is not true. But however, most of relatively liberal people and also social party and the Communist Party, even the DPJ, Democratic Party, against this legislation at all. So political parties is absolutely divided. The LDP and Come Party are affirmative, and the Social Party and Communist Party and the DPJ is against. But people is more against rather than party itself. Mainly because I think people scared some nature of direction of Prime Minister Abe for first stage of Prime Minister's period, I think. But as I said, any politicians shift the political statute or status or some imagination and policy guideline will be more principle oriented to the more flexible and pragmatic and realistic and approach, such as your commander-in-chief and the prime ministers of another country and ROK president. I think a politician is the same. But still, many people are scared that Japan will be more easy to engage a war with another country. And also a soldier, our self-defense forces soldier will be killed by a combat operation. That is not true. Our contribution is only risk support to not only U.S. forces but another forces which will be operating under the Security Council resolution. But of course, we can make to exercise a limited collective self-defense to assist and help and join the U.S. operation. But this activity is for our self-defense. So I think people have to understand how much the security environment surrounding Japan, not only Japan, but East Asia is very eminent, very dangerous, and very serious. That is the first point which I would like to make. But second is that I think this interpretation, new kind of interpretation, is a maximum limitation of interpretation under the current Constitution. If, as I said, we would like to do more, I think we have to make some constitutional reform or some modify the Constitution, especially Article 9 of Constitution. But sometimes Prime Minister raise constitutional reform. But however, I'm sure that if our politician raise constitutional reform at the present, I think more than 2/3 of the people against. So we are talking about what kind of article should be modified under the Constitution. Some people say that some balanced budget.
Right.
Or some people say environment issue. But environment issue is so difficult because we have some compete between environment and regional development.
Right.
And also the third point, which now talking about among LDP members is emergency article, such as a natural disaster.
Right.
If a large scale of natural disaster happen, Prime Minister has some sort of a limited authority to make some sort of control of freedom or personal right under the current Constitution. That is the maximum. But even so, DPJ are strongly against, because if we define the emergency include some military attack from another country or some very large scale of confusion, of social confusion in a domestic sense. Of course, natural disaster is one of the emergency, but as a total, if the emergency situations happen, okay, Prime Minister has a total authority to declare the emergency, such as the French Constitution. I think this is history back to the World War, before the World War II. So I think most of the people can imagine the old type before the World War II. So I don't think the people affirmative constitutional reform at the present. Of course, we need 2/3 of both houses to propose the constitutional amendment. So far, lower house already LDP and the Communist Party is more than 2/3, but upper house is different.
Right. I have also heard on my
Yes.
recent trips to Tokyo that with upper house elections happening in July of this year, I think there's been quite a lot of quiet about security legislation or next steps in implementing the security legislation in order to sort of calm voters and for the LDP to perhaps do better in the upper house election. Plus, of course, the G7 meeting is taking place in Japan in just a couple of months. Would you agree with that, Michael? You travel to Japan much more than I do. I hear that Prime Minister Abe ultimately would really like to change the constitution, but that it's not likely to be on the agenda in the coming up election.
Before the mic, I would like to raise one point. We should not make a first in a constitutional reform. Under current constitution, we can do more to reinforce U.S. Japan alliance, such as some sort of joint use of both base.
Yeah.
And also we have to improve some of the risk support to not only U.S. but also another military forces. Also, we have to seek for some sort of U.S. Japan joint development of technology of equipment. Also, we have to rehabilitate and promote our support and assistance to the ASEAN in order to upgrade their defense capability to manage contingency in that area. All issues is not the violation of Constitution. We have to do more to reinforce the U.S. Japan alliance. I think this is our direction of our effort.
Well, when in surveys of various kinds, when the Japanese public is asked, should Japan share data with the U.S. if there are North Korean missiles that are being fired at Guam or Hawaii of U.S. bases, majority says yes. Should Japan, U.S., and Australia do joint patrols for sea lanes? The majority says yes. And even at one point, if required, should Japan send minesweepers to support U.S. or coalition operations in the Gulf of Hormuz? And almost 60% said yes. I think the government, the Abe administration, made a couple big mistakes. One was assuming that more practical view of the alliance inoculated them from concerns about the Constitution. And people are in Japan still very worried about the Constitution. More so, I would argue, than the U.S. Japan alliance right now. They're more worried about their own government in some ways than they are about the alliance, if you peel open these polls. I don't think the government thought that the DPJ leadership would be quite as diabolical and skillful in putting out the word, a party that ran the government a few years ago, putting out the word that there would be a draft and your children would be drafted into the Japanese Defense Forces. I mean, it was so ridiculous. I think the Conte, the Prime Minister's office, underestimated how much it would resonate and didn't have a good explanation or defense ready. This is also complicated stuff. And there aren't very many experts like Morimoto Sensei who can explain it to the public. So a lot of well-meaning academics who supported Prime Minister Abe went out on TV shows and explained what this meant and over-explained it and made it sound more dangerous than it really was. So the press management wasn't good either. And now the upper house election means, as I agree with you, Andrew, very, very careful for the time being. But I think there is support for constitutional reform in the LDP and in other parties, and it will come back, although it will be hard. I'm personally not opposed to revising the Constitution. It's an oddly written Constitution. It was written by Americans and translated. It was written at a period where there were high hopes for the United Nations and collective security and sort of FDR idealism, and that's not the world that came in the subsequent decades. So I'm not opposed, and I'm quite sympathetic to the idea the Constitution would be reformed. From a very selfish and practical American perspective, I would worry that revising the Constitution would be a huge distraction from the actual work we have to do to implement the new guidelines and the collective self-defense, where quite a bit can be done and has to be done quickly. Constitutional debate, I worry, for selfish American reasons, would send us in a huge and different direction when, for the next few years, I'd personally like to see us consolidate and implement, because I didn't really fully answer your first question, but this new interpretation, this new defense guidelines review, it doesn't solve the inefficiencies in the alliance. It allows us to address them, but we still have to do plans. We have to do exercises. Australia and like-minded countries are now able to cooperate more based on this. And we have to arrange our command and control. Who's in charge? We don't even know who would be in charge in a crisis. The chief of defense forces in Japan recently said something we put in a report at CSIS, that Japan should consider a joint operational command so that there's a senior military officer in charge in a crisis. Because that's what Australia did. Because most countries, their chief of defense can't actually run a campaign. It's a very political, strategic job. And so and then who would be in charge on the U.S. side? U.S. Forces Japan, Pacific Command. So we have a lot of homework just based on what the door we've opened right now. And I'm not against constitutional reform, but I do worry if that becomes an agenda item too soon, it could kind of create an atmosphere where it's harder to do the practical things we now really have to do.
Right. It does seem like even without further change, there's a lot of homework on both sides.
Yes.
The sort of the framework for implementing the new security legislation is just being finalized this month, is my understanding, that to sort of pull together this how to actually implement the legislation that was passed back in September.
No, yes, legally, yes, our government have to finalize all legal system in order to implement this legislation. But we have many jobs to be done.
Right.
For example, we have to establish some sort of alliance coordination mechanism. And also, as Mike indicated, we have to make some sort of a joint defense plan between both countries in a contingency. And also, maybe we have to revise already have some defense joint defense plan in a contingency of Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, so as you can hear, there's quite a bit of future in the present of what's already been decided. I think it's time to wrap up this discussion. We're all going to join the reception that you're all invited to just outside for about a half an hour, and we can follow up on some more of these issues. There's a lot more to discuss, but I hope that you feel like a 50-minute summary of the last 70 years leaves you more informed than when you came, and I hope you'll help thank our speakers in helping make that happen.
Thank you.